Alrighty, folks. I hope you've been having a good conference. Let me do a quick introduction. We have a jam-packed session, so I just decided to get going. My name is Sam. I've actually strangely been within the Active Directory team from the day I joined Microsoft, and that was nearly 17 years ago. It was in '98 that I joined Microsoft in the early days of Windows 2000. So I've been working through it for quite a bit. Currently, for the last few years, I've spent my time on Active Directory Federation Services, and I do a few more things within the Active Directory team. We're a team that spans across both our Azure Active Directory efforts as well as Windows Server Active Directory. So as you can see, I put out my Twitter handle, Mr. ADFS. I've been doing that for a while, so I said, okay, let's go do that. The reason is that I'll be using that Twitter handle to kind of post new announcements on features in our next generation of server products between the domain controllers as well as Federation Services. So if you want to stay abreast, feel free to follow me on Twitter. Okay, so I'm going to get started. But before I talk about the agenda, one of the key things of our vision within Microsoft around the identity space and Active Directory is really about establishing a great hybrid identity solution. Now, you might have seen this slide in other sessions already, but I'm going to run through that. Typically, we've had applications and you've had directories up on premises, where you've had, over the years with Active Directory, you've got single sign-on to these, you've been able to manage security and secure access to some of these applications. But the world is changing, where you have more of cloud-based applications between accessing Azure, accessing Office 365, accessing thousands of other SaaS applications for driving your business requirements. Now, our hybrid solution is Microsoft Azure Active Directory being able to be that bridge to both your on-premises as well as your cloud applications. And it can offer you a great seamless connection experience, offer you single sign-on across both on-prem and cloud applications, as well as enable self-service functions. A good example is think about self-service of passwords as a good way. Now, that's the vision with which that we operate. And the reason I brought this slide in, even though I'm going to be focusing on our on-premises products, is really giving you that view of that hybrid cloud that we essentially are a big proponent of, especially for larger organizations. Smaller organizations, we give you full ability for you to kind of run through in the cloud. Now, that's a bit in terms of my cloud speak for this session. Now, one of the key things that's kind of changed in how we operate within the Active Directory team is that gone are the days where we really looked at it from the perspective of features. Our planning process essentially is around really thinking about scenarios or themes out of which we drive what features that we need. And so rather than talking about features, I kind of put down in my agenda where I'll talk about some of the themes that you'll see the investments in Windows Server 2016 in Active Directory domain services and Federation Services. So the first is, again, I talked to you about the hybrid identity story. It is really about continuing to enhance that, make that better. We've already enabled quite a bit of hybrid functionality, especially with Office 365 and Azure Active Directory. And I'm going to talk about some additional capabilities on how we are continuing to enhance that. The next aspect is something that Satya probably and Brad in its keynote mentioned is about conditional access. And I'll show you a little more from the on-premises and ADFS view how we are improving where there's better MDM integration, especially when you have EMS and Intune in play. The next area is really about how many of you have a little bit of a developer focus and application focus? All right, we have a few folks out here. So the next area is really about Active Directory Federation Services. We support a set of protocols for applications to sign in. We continue to enhance that for the next round of applications that are built on RESTful services, and I'll talk a little bit about our enhancements for OpenID Connect and OAuth. Across Active Directory, we care deeply about making sure that people can sign in seamlessly in a secure manner. So we continue to refine some of our experiences there, and a lot of our functionality here is based on customer feedback that we've had from Server 2012 R2. Finally, I'm also going to be focusing on Azure AD Domain Services, and I'm going to be upfront on some of this, where a lot of the scenarios in which we made changes to our domain controllers are actually being represented in other sessions. I'll talk about some of those sessions, but I'll give you an inkling of what changed and some of the details within the domain controller functionality to enable these scenarios. Finally, we, within the Active Directory team, we also own Time Service for the Windows Server product. And I'll show some cool stuff that we've done on Time as well, and show you that at the end of this session. All right, let's get started. Now, as part of our hybrid story, our notion of enabling that connect that you saw in the earlier slide was about Azure AD Connect. Now, that's our moving forward story. It hasn't GA'd yet, but it's going to GA pretty soon. But it's about establishing that connection for synchronization and sign-in for your hybrid identity solution. I'm not going to spend much time. You see the session code. Jen and Andreas are going to talk about it tomorrow morning, so feel free to go there and see how simple it is for you to get connected up to our cloud, which is for Office 365 or for the thousands of SaaS applications behind Azure AD. Now, within that Azure AD Connect, we actually do support the ability to sign in with ADFS as well. So we make this a lot more simpler for you and streamlined for you to connect it up to our cloud. Having said that, one of the things within Active Directory Federation Services, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about ADFS right now. One of the things with Active Directory Federation Services, we have thousands of customers essentially using Active Directory Federation Services to enable sign-in of those users to Office 365. Now, a key piece of feedback that we've received from customers is that, hey, my users, typically, I have a bunch of users in my Active Directory domain services, and ADFS does a great job of signing those users in. But we've also heard from customers essentially where I also have a population of my organization stored in LDAP directories. These could be Novell directories, Oracle directories, ADLDS, a wide variety of LDAP directories out there. And in some of these cases, especially EDU organizations, we've heard that quite a bit, is that we want them also to get access to Office services. So one of the things that we've added is the ability to support any LDAP v3 compliant directory and enable that to be authenticated out of Active Directory Federation Services. So it's just not about authenticating users in my Active Directory domain services, but in any LDAP directory. So as a result, you just bind your LDAP directories to your ADFS system, and the same relationships in terms of authenticating to give access to partner organizations or to the cloud with Office 365 or Azure AD, we are now enabling in Server vNext or Server 2016. Now, how does this work? Now, for those of you how many of you are aware of ADFS? Okay, we've got quite a few hands out here. So the model within ADFS is that we have something called a claims provider. A claims provider is meant to say, represent an entity that authenticates the user. Now, it could be Active Directory itself, and that comes default in ADFS. Or it could be a third-party claims provider that you have enabled through some form of a SAML federation or a WS federation, and you enable from a third-party organization. How we've modeled authenticating LDAP directories is that it's just yet another claims provider within Active Directory. You can create a claims provider that is attached to an LDAP directory, and that enables that. Now, as we develop this feature, one of the key things that we noticed based on customer feedback is that it enables two interesting scenarios. Today, if you have users in an Active Directory forest in your DMZ, in a one-way forest trust model, the current deployment model is fairly challenging in a few ways. There's ways you can go do that. But now, with the notion of being able to use the LDAP protocol to authenticate the user through a simple bind mechanism, you can treat an untrusted forest or a one-way trust forest just as yet another LDAP directory. So this gives you an easy deployment model where, for example, imagine that you are dealing with a merger, all right? At that point in time, you haven't established Active Directory forest trust or you haven't migrated. But you can enable the application access in a simple manner, at least by attaching that Active Directory as an additional LDAP directory. And over a period of time, after you migrate your users from and have a unified organization, then you get the same seamless single sign-on benefits of your system. Another interesting point, a core portion of our scenario was also targeted for Office 365. So to enable legacy native client applications, we require you to register the suffix of the user within that LDAP directory so that we can locate which account store that we need to log in and establish, validate the user, and then give them access into Office 365. Now let me move to a quick demo. One note, since it's a fairly big room, I will try, if you have any questions, I'd suggest holding them until the end of the session. And I'm also going to be around as well as in the booth, so feel free to come by and ask questions. But if you're going to ask a question, make sure you find a mic that's out there so that everyone else can benefit from it. All right. So I'm on a client machine. So I have lots of accounts. I'm going to use an in-private browsing session. So I'm just going to attempt to log in into the Outlook Web Apps app. Now, before I do that, I'm going to show you. So I actually, for the purposes of the demo, this can be any LDAP directory. It doesn't have to be a Microsoft AD-LDS instance. But for the purposes of the demo, I have an AD-LDS instance. It currently is, as you can see, I have a user's container within that, and I just have one user. This is my first boss when I joined Microsoft, so I said, OK, let me add Tom's name in there. And you can also see, I'm going to go to my ADFS system. I have already set up this local claims provider trust. And within that, you will see a few things. I just highlighted a few properties out here. We have a name. We also support the ability to use support inet person or users. And I can also point to a specific container under which I'm searching for the users out there. You can see the LDAP server connection as well as the organizational account suffix and the identifier of this local claims provider trust. Now I'm going to go back to my client machine and then type in Tom's login ID. And he happens to be all part of the vendors in Contoso 100 environment. Now, something that you're quite familiar with, as soon as Azure Active Directory determines that you are a federated user, it takes you out. Now I've landed at the login screen. A few interesting tidbits that we've actually done is that Azure Active Directory sends the username. Now we detect that it happens to be a vendors.contoso100.com suffix. As a result, we've already located that it's the account store that's the LDAP directory that we need to log in, and I'm taken straight to the login screen for me to kind of sign in. I remember my password. And that's pretty much it. We've just enabled logging in with an LDAP directory and into Office 365. And this can work with your native apps or your web applications, and it doesn't matter. We support all those use cases. All right, we've already had someone send email, so that's good. OK, so now I'm going to move back into my presentation. I have a few things that people can go read, but I'll give you the essence of it. The first portion is essentially about establishing an LDAP server connection, where you can point to an LDAP server. You can say how you want to authenticate to that LDAP server, and we establish that. Think of this as equivalent to parameter sets within PowerShell. Now, the next option is, hey, there are a couple of interesting things that when we log in, what are the types of claims about the user that you want to extract? So we establish these claim type mappings where you can map an attribute within your LDAP directory into a claim type. So that's the second portion. And finally, the third portion is really about adding the claims provider trust. We have a new new PowerShell commandlet called add local claims provider trust, because it's local to the ADFS system, and where you can specify other options, where you want to search. What is the anchor claim type? The anchor claim type is interesting because that becomes the core unique identifier for those users within that directory. In addition, the same notion of what we support today of acceptance claims transforms within claims provider trust is supported. All right, the next area is when we think about hybrid, we've got to get back into some notion of basics. One huge portion of feedback that we've had is that we actually required people to migrate from ADFS 2.0 instances to ADFS 2012 R2. And for some people, they liked it actually because it gives them isolation. But a lot of people said, we don't like that model. So one of the key things, in addition to if you want to migrate, you can go migrate, we've just made it easy for you to move from 2012 R2 into a Windows Server 2016. And the model is quite simple. It looks very similar to how you handle domain controllers today. All you do is add a new 2016 node into the farm. At that point in time, ADFS really acts in app compat mode. And the reason that we did it was that everything that used to work today, we wanted to continue to work seamlessly before. This gives you, the administrator, the ability to validate your existing scenarios without worrying about throwing some big switch. Now, you can validate the existing functionality and keep adding more nodes. And finally, we have a notion of upgrading the farm version. We call it the FBL, the farm behavior level. And once you upgrade, all the new capabilities of that 2016 system that needs to be consistent across all the nodes light up. Now, the model is that let me kind of walk you through. So you can see the color change where I'm swapping out nodes where from a lighter blue to a darker blue, where I've moved to the next version of Windows. And I move that. And at that point in time, I essentially can move from my farm level, the behavior level, from 2012 R2 capability to the 2016 capability. And that's pretty much it. The interesting bit is that for most of our functionality, for you to, or rather pretty much just one feature does it, but is you do not need to move your web application proxy servers up. It'll continue to work with its new features because we do a lot of the heavy lifting within the ADFS system. And as a result, you can then move them as well, and then you have a new version. Now, also as part of our hybrid efforts, I'm not going to spend time on this. We have a new service as part of Azure AD called Azure AD Connect Health as well. And this is a service that our goal, our vision is essentially, this is a service that gives you the ability to monitor and gain insights into your identity infrastructure that spans across on-premises. And we started with ADFS, but we'll be adding Sync pretty soon and some other components. And expands to some of your cloud capabilities, the cloud applications that you have with Azure AD. But it's just not about monitoring. It's about also really thinking about login insights. Now, more and more people are very security conscious. And to drive that security conscious, having access to data in an analytical form and easy to consume form is important. And as you can see, for example, on the report on the right, you can see how people are authenticating. You can see Windows authentication, Forms authentication, multi-factor authentication, certificate. This gives you the ability to analyze both logins as well as login failures. And upcoming, for example, we'll be adding things like show the top users with bad usernames and passwords so that you can perform additional forensic analysis on that. This is also going to be covered and demoed at the Azure AD Connect session tomorrow morning. Now I'm moving on to the next area. So one of the key things that we did in 2012 R2 and ADFS was we introduced the notion of conditional access. It was great because we took the notion of just thinking about users, all right, and expanded it into devices as well as network location capabilities. And we added a lot of functionality. However, there were like two key gaps that we saw based on customer feedback for us. One is that we didn't have a good story that went beyond an authenticated device, along with user authentication, that was really about securing access based on whether the device was compliant or not. And that was a key aspect that we had a gap. And we've been working through that, and I'll talk about that more. The other key gap that we found was that, how many of you know about the ADFS claims language? Okay, fewest show of hands. How many of you think it really is hard and it sucks? Excellent. All right. All right. So that was, again, a key piece of feedback. People had these amazing, they had these business requirements, but they had challenges. We had our claims language was flexible and powerful, but they had really challenges to how to translate what they wanted into something that ADFS understood. There are some power users out here, I'm sure I see a few, who could kind of weave in and out of that, but it wasn't really easy. One of the areas of improvements that we've also made is really about enhancing our UI experience so that it is easy for you to establish these types of conditional policies. Now let's talk, I'm going to go straight to a demo. All right, remember. Okay, let's close this out. So we're going to start by trying to access my popular Who Am I app. So I'm going to log in as John. And you can notice out here right now I have a bunch of user claims about John. Interesting how John authenticated. And one of the areas that we continue to kind of enhance our claims data is around request claims. You can see lots of good data about the request. You can see that I logged in through a proxy because I'm connected up to the open network which goes through the internet. As well as you can see the user IP, which is a normalized claim based on which gives you the client IP address that is connecting up to the ADFS system to log in. So all of that is good data. Now I'm going to go change and show you how simple it is to kind of add to a compliant device. I'm going to go to the ADFS management snap-in, and this management snap-in has been modified a little bit. All right, we've kind of restructured a few elements within that snap-in. But what you see on the left right now is something called access control policies. Access control policies are essentially like templates. You can build a template. Imagine you have an HBI application. You have a standard policy for HBI application. You can just create a template for your HBI application and then assign it into multiple applications that you deem to be a HBI. So now we've also kind of shipped some built-in policies. You can see a few of those, and you can see that from the default policy column. And you see about 6 of those built-in policies, and I'll spend some more time on those a bit later. But I've already created a policy for compliant devices. So all I have to do is go to my Who Am I application, and I go and hit Edit Access Control Policy. And the list of policies that's out there is shown on which policy that I want to choose. And I'm going to choose the Permit Everyone from Compliant Devices. And I'll say OK. Now let's go back to my client application and try to log in. There you go. I've already been denied access because I applied that policy, which is a template, into my Who Am I application. This is a customized message, and that message can be customized on a per application basis. You have a lot of flexibility in customizing those messages. So now, all right, so I need to get compliant. Now, I already have established, wait, if I can find my mouse. All right. And I'm going to go into PC settings. Now I'm showing you a Windows 8.1 experience. This experience is a little fragmented, but at the same point in time, it gives you still the end-to-end functionality. In Windows 10, as you'll probably see in a Friday session done by Jairo, you'll see that integration happen in a much more seamless manner behind the scenes. So here I'm going to do 2 steps out here. I'm going to first join this device. And then I'm going to turn on management for this device. And I'm going to be prompted to log in again. And this is where I mentioned our experience is a bit fragmented. But I could have chosen Keep Me Signed, which I didn't, which I've at least kept my logins within there. Now, one of the key things out here is that as part of the enrollment process, I actually have an Intune subscription here. As part of my enrollment process, I've configured it to say require multi-factor authentication. So when I am enrolling, the Intune system, as part of sending the request back to ADFS, says, hey, ADFS, this is for enrollment, so please do multi-factor authentication behind the scenes. And so as a result, ADFS is saying, all right, let's do multi-factor authentication. I've configured that with Azure MFA. So hopefully, if my signal was right, otherwise I'm a little bit okay. You can see. Okay, hopefully that. I just responded with a pin on my phone, and as you can now see that I am ready to get enrolled. I have to agree a few things, scary things, but hey, all in the notion of security. So, and I'm now enrolled. So let's try to see if I can view this. I'm going to go to the company. Oops. The PC settings froze. There you go. So now you can see that I am actually, okay, this is not this device, so I just was able to kind of do that, and I am supposedly in compliance. Now, one of the ways, I'll come back to explaining it, but I'm going to actually make time go a little faster by actually synchronizing this a little right now. And while that is synchronizing, I am going to go back to my PowerPoint and explain a few of the concepts. So what's happening behind the scenes is that I'm actually registering with Azure AD. And there's a service called Azure Device Registration Service that orchestrates this for me. Now, as part of that, I'm logging into Azure Active Directory. And you see, in this case, I'm actually logging back into my federation service with ADFS. And I'm also prompted to do multi-factor authentication. Now, behind the scenes, what we've done is that we have created a device credential for that device. It essentially depends on different devices, but in this case, we are provisioning a certificate behind the scenes that we use to authenticate the device. And that's all orchestrated, and Intune and Azure AD know about these things, and they are co-located. So what Intune does is that as part of getting the device enrolled, it evaluates the compliance against the policy and then reports to Azure AD about that policy. And finally, we have a device object that is represented in Azure AD that represents this device. And within that device, we have something called a compliance attribute and whether the device is managed or not. Intune, as part of its evaluation, then goes and reports this into that device object that's out there. And what we're now doing is essentially for ADFS to consume that same data, all right, is essentially we're using Azure AD Connect to bring back those devices into my local AD so that that ADFS system out there can consume it for conditional access, right? To be able to respond to that policy of is access coming from a compliant device. Now, there's a key point that I want to make here. What you just saw is a unified view of users and devices that spans across both my on-premises world as well as my cloud world. And that's one of our goals, saying that users and devices should be a unified aspect of the hybrid Active Directory story. Now, beyond that, you could have apps living up in the cloud, or apps that live on premises, and we can do secure access and limit access only to compliant devices. Now let's go back to my, hopefully things have proceeded, and see what happens if I try to, all right, that did complete. Let's close that and try to access the same application that I was denied access before. There you go. Now I have access. And just to prove that, I'll show you a bunch of new claims that ADFS has already gotten as part of that. You can see a whole slew of new claims that showed up out here. You can see a few set of claims of saying, is it managed? You can see a true. You can see, is it compliant? It's true. We also have a device trust type. And this implies that this was a workplace join machine because it was my personal machine that I had workplace join. Or in some cases, it'll be domain join machines, and it could be a classic domain join, or it could be the new form of domain join that we have that we'll be talking about in Friday's session called Azure AD Join. Similarly, we have a few other set of capabilities. But the whole notion is that this data drives both ADFS on-premises as well as Azure Active Directory in the cloud in a unified manner based on wherever you're driving conditional access. And that's the point, a key point that I want to make. Okay. So what you just saw was that we can now enable access only from devices that are managed and are compliant. We are adding a notion of the support where, how many of you really, let me get a show of hands, how many of you care to only restrict it to domain joined machines? All right, I see a thing. How many of you only want restriction to corporate managed machines? Some more. How many of you only want to restrict to managed or compliant devices? A few more. All right. So that's our notion is that the device is essentially has different forms of data or different status levels. It could be managed. It could be compliant. It could just be an authenticated device, which means we're not managing the device. But we at least can authenticate the device, which gives us this huge differentiation from any client endpoint that comes from the internet. The next level is really thinking about managed devices, and the next level is thinking about domain join devices, whether it's AD join or Active Directory domain join. We support all of those, and this becomes a lot seamless in our Windows 10 devices. Now, that's great from an access standpoint, but one of the key things as part of having a compliant device is that we actually give you like seamless sign-in. Now, if I actually went back, and I'll show that a little later, if I logged into that Who Am I application again, I'm not going to be prompted because we are recognizing the device, and as a result, we know that it's a compliant device, and so we're giving you seamless access. But if that compliance changed for some reason, we would immediately revoke that single sign-on status and make the user go sign in again. Now moving on to access control policies. You briefly saw that, and I'm just going to go back under mine and just walk you through that briefly. So I'm going to go back to my access control policies that's out here. And I'm going to just to showcase this, I'm going to create a new policy. I'll zoom this in a second. All right, now I'm going to zoom in. So one of the things that we did was that we tried, okay, access control and authoring is actually fairly challenging in lots of ways. So we tried a bunch of models, and we finally found that people actually liked a little bit like mailbox rules. So you'll see some familiarity with mailbox rules within our representation. Now you can create multiple of these policies. So I'm going to kind of walk my way through some set of policies. So let's imagine that I'm going to say, I want to permit all intranet users from the intranet. So that becomes as simple as that. I just went in and I said, all right, let me zoom that in again. I just said, permit users from intranet network. So as a result, any access request that came from the intranet is going to be allowed. Now the next notion is that I am going to say, But if I'm coming from outside the network, I need to do multi-factor authentication. So let's just add that. Now I'm going to add another rule that says from the internet. Or I could have specified an IP address range as well, if I cared to. And I'm going to say required multi-factor authentication. And that's it. So now I've added the notion of saying all internet users get access seamlessly because I trust my internal network, that how you got into it. But if you came in from outside, I need you to do multi-factor authentication. Now, it so happens that in lots of cases, people essentially, for your privileged admins, you don't care. You want them always to do multi-factor authentication because they have privileged access. So as a result, you say, OK, if I'm from a specific group, and I'll explain that in a second. I can just say domain admins. And I'm going to just say they always have to do multi-factor authentication. And just another aspect that I wanted to do is that what you see was all a bunch of static set of rules. But one of the things, when you think about template management, is that there are certain types of policies in which things vary based on a per application basis. And let me give you an example. Imagine that only a certain set of admins have full access, all right, to an application, and it's defined by a security group. Or you want to say this security group has to do MFA, because the admins of an application, you need to do MFA. We have this notion of what's called parameterized templates. The way it does is that you leave it empty. You say, I want a security group, and that security group should do multi-factor authentication. But when you go and assign that template to an application, at that point in time, we ask, hey, which security group is part of for this application that needs to do multi-factor authentication? And just to kind of show that, I'll probably do I'm going to change this. And I'm going to convert that to a parameter. And you can see that now becomes a parameter. And I'll try to apply it to an application. And you can see that experience. I've got the Ignite demo policy. I go into my applications, and let's take my simple claims web app. And I'm going to say edit claims issuance, edit access control policy. And I say my Ignite demo. And now to fill it for this specific application, I say it so happens to be my domain admins group. And that's as simple as that. So that as you apply these templates to applications, you can define the actual values to these parameters. Now, another area of improvement for us is that there's always going to be a lot of people we see use their own set of claim types. Now, I'm going to go back to the same policy. I'm going to say properties, add. We've also added the ability in which you can actually also specify any of our claim types that's defined in the dictionary, or you can define that locally by saying http://foo, and then. But the best part is that no more regex matches. We give you simple things like contains, begins with, ends with, so that it's easy for you to establish these rules to kind of lock down access. OK, that concludes this portion of the demo. All right, just to recap, these are access control policies. We've done a huge improvement where a UI interface that gives you the ability to author policies in a seamless manner. A templatized model that gives you the ability to manage multiple apps within a single policy. And within that template, you essentially have both parameterized as well as static templates where you can assign values to these templates. Moving forward, again, around that hybrid story, our operational management is also part of that. Previously, ADFS, you had to be a local admin on the box. One of the key complaints from customers was that, hey, I have role separation between my server administrator and my ADFS service administrator. We've just enabled, and I don't want the server admins to kind of muck around with the ADFS policy settings, and as a result, I could have a critical outage. So what we have now added is a notion of delegated service management. This is assigning a service security group on who can manage the ADFS service. And in addition, you can also add local administrators or the local system account, because we had to take into account how people typically run SCOM agents as well. So that's something that we've added support for. Another area of improvement is that in 2012 R2, we actually added a bunch of audits that was quite comprehensive, but it kind of sucked for the sole purpose. A single login essentially generated about 80 audits. All right? It's really hard to kind of make sense of that audit. What we've done is we've collapsed all of those audits into a very few audits. It's about 2 audits or 1 audit based on the use case. And within those audits, what we've also done is ensured that it's all schematized. So if you are in the business of parsing, you have easier ways to parse, because these are all standard schematized view of those. The next area that I'm kind of moving on to is modern applications. Now, in 2012 R2, we really focused on the BYOD areas, because people were building apps for devices. And natively on these devices, you build these RESTful services. And the classic protocols that we supported weren't really good to support RESTful services. So one of the things that we made improvements in 2012 R2 was essentially taking those applications, and we added support for something called OAuth. OAuth is an easy way, a simple, internet-friendly protocol to be able to easily access RESTful services in a secure manner. Now, however, it just wasn't sufficient. When we're really thinking about how web applications are, we anticipate people would want OpenID Connect, because it really makes it easy where you can build an application that is both a web frontend as well as a web service that supports your native client applications. So as a result, we've added support for OpenID Connect, and from there, you can use the OAuth protocol to access your web API that actually satisfies services the data. Same thing out here. Now the native application can easily use OAuth to go and be able to access the web API. Now, we didn't stop there. We also built the notion of you have server-side applications that need to interact with other services. At that point in time, the server-side application identifies as itself. All right? Think of in OAuth terms, it's called confidential client. And it identifies itself and asks for access to this web API. So that's additional support that we've added. And finally, is that most apps aren't very simple single-tiered apps or single client-server apps. They typically tend to be multi-tiered apps. And to support a delegation model that transfers the user's context all the way to the back end, we support now, and on behalf of Flow, using OAuth. It's a common extension that both Azure AD and ADFS supports. So in a quick kind of view, there's additional profiles that we've added. One is called implicit profile within OAuth, and this is really to support single-page applications that use JavaScript or Angular.js. Now, we've also added support for scripting apps through a profile called resource owner password, where a script has a credential and then can essentially connect up to RESTful services using that profile. And I also mentioned this on behalf of support, which is called OBO, that enables multi-tiered applications. Now, from a tokens perspective, we have the notion of something called ID tokens, which is part of the OpenID Connect and OAuth protocol specifications. And we support this notion of confidential clients. The OAuth model is really about a delegation model, where clients can act on behalf of the user to connect to a service. Now, confidential clients are all part of this multi-tiered server app ecosystem, where a one-tiered node can talk to another tiered node, identifying itself. Now, one of the things that we've added as part of confidential clients that is slightly different from Azure AD, or in addition to what Azure AD supports, is essentially where you can represent in a Active Directory environment, people run applications under a Windows account. So you can represent Windows account as a confidential client, so you can use Windows authentication of that client to be able to log in. And similarly with OpenID Connect, I'm going to jump straight into my demo out here. I'm going to go to my Visual Studio system. Now, one of the things that we, within the Active Directory team, we released a bunch of samples using Azure AD, all right, where we have a sample for Azure AD to work with OpenID Connect. This is what that sample, a startup auth of that sample looks like, where you can see a few instances coming out of web.config out here where you can, that represents the Azure AD instance. And now I'm going to show you what it looks like with ADFS. And you can see there's a few additional parameters where we talk about the ADFS instance, and additionally, I get to specify what application that I'm trying to access. If what application that I need to access and what is my redirect URI for the application. And that is pretty much it. Now you have the same sample that works against Azure AD, works against ADFS, because we built, our goal is essentially to enable protocols that are consistent and standard across both our cloud world as well as our on-premises world. And this is that perspective where we're bringing all that protocol support. Now, a key thing, reasons for some of the reasons is that, how many of you know what Azure Stack is? All right. Azure Stack, for those of you who didn't raise their hands, is, think about it as a private Azure that lives in your own data center. And Azure Stack can then use the same protocols that Azure uses to log in, where it can use ADFS to essentially facilitate that login process in exactly the same way. Azure team builds it in one single way, and they deploy both in a cloud instance as well as in an on-premises instance. And that is why we are driving to have a consistent hybrid story, even for our protocols effort. Okay. Now, that's, oops, I lost my, okay. That was my demo. Now, moving forward, it's about sign-in. With the ADFS, there's a lot of things that happen as part of sign-in. Now, there are a couple of interesting things that we did. Excuse me. One of the key pieces of feedback that we had, and this was quite interesting, all right? Now, we lived in a world where we thought that, hey, after ADFS 2.0, we changed it and moved it away from IIS. And we used an underlying HTTP.sys for varying reasons. Perf, flexibility for authentication, there's a lot of reasons. Now, one of the things that we said, okay, hey, we think that people have customized things. So let's make sure that we add some of customization capabilities into ADFS itself. So we added support for customization of the pages, messages, and we had a lot of good stuff in 2012 R2. But it was amazing as to the amount of feedback that we got after we released 2012 R2, because the number of people that came out and said, oh my goodness, I'm doing this customization. How do I do that in this new world? And we've guided most people towards actually having customization because either the features or functionality, or we added support for JavaScript customization so that people could drive the right sign-in experiences for the end users. Now, one key gap that we found out was that we have a lot of organizations that are service providers, and they use ADFS. And at that point in time, having an application branded experience is key to that, because you want to drive the applications, that sign-in experience that looks very similar for that application. And it's not about the organization view, it's about the application view. So we saw a lot of feedback from customers around, hey, we need support for that. And that's something that we just added. You have the ability now where you can drive a per RP customization that changes the entire look and feel of your web page, your sign-in page, based on what app that you're going to. For example, you have simple ways in which you can change the sign-in page description. For example, a good example there is that, hey, I need to change what I'm going to tell the user, or what links that the end user goes for help desk. Those are typical things that could change based on an application. So that's a simple view. Now, we also added support for changing the image and the branding and the logo of it as well. So in a very simple manner. Finally, we also give you full capability where you can have custom JavaScript on a per application basis, where you can change the UI widgets, add new UI widgets within the page to kind of drive in your right experiences. For example, there are things that people do with drop-down lists that I know of, things that hide elements or show elements and change the experience based on using that JavaScript customization. And finally, across all of this, not only do we do it on a per RP level, but if you have a series of apps that need to share a certain look and feel and a theme, then we also give you the ability where you can create a custom web theme and then assign those to those specific applications as well. Now I'm going to move on to a quick demo to show that. It's quite simple. So let me go back to my ADFS server. And let's try to go look into my PowerShell. So what I have here is the same Who Am I app that I've been demoing so far. I'm just going to go and you saw what that left side of the image looked like. It looked, like a nice cool graffiti with this woman sitting there on a bench. So I'm going to change that to, again, one of our Microsoft Brand Tools approved images out there. I did try to get another custom image, but I couldn't. And all you have to do is target the application and then say, hey, the illustration image, which is the image that you see on the left, is going to be a new image. So let me run this PowerShell. And then let's go back to our client machine and try to log in again. So since I have seamless sign-in, because now I'm on a compliant device, I'm going to use an in-private browser. The same application, and now you can see that entire application experience can change based on this application. If I went to another application, you'd still see the same old login pages that you've done. This is specifically for this application. And I've just shown you a bit in terms of how it kind of goes and looks. I can change that logo. I can change what I show on the right side, and with a full custom web theme and CSS functionality, you have a lot of power in your hands, where we offer you the ability to do things in a simple manner, but also give you a rich, flexible solution for you to really being a service provider. You can customize this based on a per app experience. Okay. All right, I have a couple of examples out here. And for example, the first one is really about just changing the sign-in description. Or the second example shows changing the illustration and the logo. And the final one is really the deep customization that you can do by changing the JavaScript that gets triggered as part of the page being rendered, so that you can control UI elements to drive the experience that you need. All right, another area of our investment is you saw all of this notion where once you have an authenticated device, one of our key objectives, and you'll see this happening across a lot of our investments, is that our goal as part of improving security is to really try to eliminate usernames and passwords, especially from the extranet. And that's our objective. And you'll see a lot of investments in Windows 10, like us and ADFS. We're doing more and more to essentially try to avoid that notion. And one of the key things is that you just saw that authenticated device, where it's seamlessly authenticating as a device at that point in time. We now have the functionality where, because that device is strongly bound to the user, we actually have that in the directory data. We now you as an admin can opt to say, do I want to allow that as a seamless user at device credential that represents the user and the device? Once you do that, we will recognize that by default and then be able to seamlessly assign you in. And you can say, hey, I want to enable this for my extranet only. And that's fine as well. What happens behind the scenes is that we will try to get a credential to log in the device in a seamless fashion. If we can't, then we fall back to our regular login mechanisms that are driven by policy in the extranet. Now, this is really interesting. The Azure Remote App team came to us and said, hey, Azure Remote App is great. We can kind of go sign in. But once you click on getting to a specific application that is about logging into that virtual session, I'm asked to sign in again. And this is most prevalent in non-Windows devices. All right? You actually need to provide your credential again. And the Azure Remote App team came say, hey, can we go find a way to kind of enable this kind of login in a seamless manner? Because this is one of our key areas of feedback that's coming to us. So we went and scratched our heads. We tried doing things in which we can make ADFS and domain controllers work together. There's lots of things that we said, and oh my goodness, that required a lot of those changes, required huge deployment changes for us. So we came up with a slightly smarter solution. We said, okay, those sessions, one of the key things that Windows Login supports is the notion of being able to do a cert-based login. And so what we've done is that ADFS now becomes a certificate authority to your ADCS backend, which gives you your login certs within your AD environment. And as a result, a proxy component like the Azure Remote Desktop host that lives on those virtual machines can now say, hey, I'm Azure Remote App. Here is the token for the user that represents the user. Please give me a short-lived certificate that I can log into the virtual machine. Now, ADFS will do that, evaluate that, and proxy that request back to your AD certificate services that can then kind of provision a certificate, and we hand it back to the host, the RDS host on the virtual machine, and that can then enable that virtual machine. Now, as we started thinking about that, this is also an interesting place where there are other scenario benefits from it. As you are considering about moving applications where the front end of the application lives in the cloud, your back end of the application lives on premises, but you want to ensure that the user is impersonated back on premises. One model is that you can build a gateway component like through Azure Service Bus to essentially enable that and be able to log into your on-premises application on behalf of the user using Kerberos constraint delegation. But in environments where Kerberos constraint delegation is hard, this becomes an easy mechanism for you because it really can transfer across Forest Trust. It really doesn't matter. It's about your certificate authority that is trusted within the appropriate domain controller for logging in the user. And then you can do a full impersonation of that user using that certificate. And then subsequently, you can access the application out there. So this was like a neat trick where we can kind of we can enable that form of a hybrid solution without necessarily trying to change the entire domain controller infrastructure for us to kind of go make that work. All right, now I'm kind of coming back into some work in our Active Directory domain services. Now, a lot of our work that we're doing is really focused on broader scenarios. And this area that I'm going to talk about in terms of the details is really about enabling privileged identity management. It's about restricting admin access within your enterprise. And the entire solution is in Mark's privileged identity management session. I think that's tomorrow. But I'm going to talk about some of the details. So a core notion of privilege management was that we needed expiring time memberships. So we added this support within our domain controllers. Now, typically, for those of you who understand how the domain controller works, is that we have something called links, all right, where you can link two objects. And this is how we have group memberships in AD today. You've got the group, you've got the member attribute, and that is essentially a link to the user where you actually have the DN of the user. We've enhanced that link where not only can you represent it as a pure DN, you can go represent it as where it has a time to live that lives in the link. So we've just expanded that notion where that link now contains a time to live within that member attribute. But we're just showing the member, but this can work across any linked attribute. It's a generic functionality. Now, as a result, what happens is that when you log in, the domain controller essentially understands as it evaluates group memberships. It understands that, okay, some of these memberships are determined by a TTL. And it takes the shortest of the time left and then establishes that as the length of your TGT. So as a result, you have a TGT for the user that is only as long as your expiring membership, which means that once that time expires, you have to get a new TGT. We do not support renews in this model, and as a result, you will actually have to do a Control-Alt-Delete or log in again, essentially to get a new TGT. Now, the same goes within a service ticket as well, because service tickets also have local domain, resource local domain group memberships that are evaluated. The same principle applies. It becomes the shortest of your TGT or whatever is the TTL, smallest TTL within your resource local domain groups. Now, of course, to make all of this work consistently, we actually do need an FFL. We actually, so that everyone can evaluate those group memberships in a consistent manner, and we actually have a scavenger thread that cleans up those group memberships and makes that disappear from the directory as well. Now, that is always a challenge. We have always been working hard to make sure that you can gain the benefits of most of our new functionality without necessarily going to FFL. But in some cases, that's unavoidable. So as a result, we add this what's called as a just-in-time forest. You don't need to touch your existing forest, all right? And what we do is that you go create a new Server 2016 forest where it actually has, all right, okay. So it actually has a new forest type that we've defined called the PIM forest type, all right? And this is the internal name. I forget what our external name is going to be, but hey, we've been calling it the PIM forest type. Now, within that forest type, there's special rules in which it allows SIDs from another forest to kind of go into a target user forest. So this essentially is why we actually created a new forest type. And I'll explain why in a bit. So what happens is that in that new forest, you go create shadow groups represented by that green multiple users in that. And you can represent a shadow group that represents, let's say, your domain administrators, all right? And then you go remove all your domain admins from your existing domain admins group. And then the PIM system behind the scenes will manage that using time-to-live group memberships. So imagine the workflow to be this way. I go to the PIM system and say, I need domain admin access, all right? So as a result, I'm logged in as me, and I might be required to be approved. I might be required to provide multi-factor credential. What the PIM system will do is that create a TTL, create a log you in, log you in as the shadow user that has a TTL membership to the shadow group that has the same SID as your domain admins group. Now, as a result, you will get a TGT from the new forest that contains those set of SIDs with a shortened time based on that TTL of that domain admins group that the PIM system set. And when you then do a resource ticket into where you're kind of getting a new cross-realm TGT into the new forest, that new forest type will now enable that for you to have those same SIDs getting represented within the cross-realm TGT. So now when you try to go access, let's say, a file server as trying to do the domain admins, or you're trying to perform another operation, your service ticket will contain the same domain admin SID that is valid within your domain, and as a result, you get access. And remember again, that TGT that you got was the shortest lived for that 1 hour or few hours that you were granted admin access by the PIM system. Does that make sense? A few nods? All right. So our whole focus was saying that, okay, we needed to make invasive domain controller changes to make this work, but at the same point in time, we want to enable that functionality without having to change any of your existing forests. You can achieve this model by just setting up a separate admin forest in which you're controlling your admin accounts, and as a result, you're starting to grant access, where none of your admin groups within your existing forest would ever be populated, and it'll be all handled by a PIM system. Finally, within our domain controllers, we also have, we've added support quite a bit for the newer Windows 10 models. Now, I'm selecting a few of these where it has some impact on ADDS or ADFS. The first is a notion called, I think Joe in his keynote talked about Microsoft Passport. Microsoft Passport is, again, yet another aspect of us continuing to really work towards eradicating usernames and passwords, which are one of our biggest threats in most organizations. And Microsoft Passport is essentially a strong credential bound to a device that is TPM attested within that. Now, it could be that your credential is a Windows 10 phone, or it could be a Windows 10 PC. And we support both models. Now, behind the scenes, the next generation of the domain-joined machines can now log in using Microsoft Passport. Now, to support that, we actually have made a bunch of domain controller changes to support, instead of using standard pkinit, we can essentially use underlying raw keys that are part of that Microsoft Passport that are strongly stored stored securely in a TPM and attested as such. And so when I do Windows login, I can now use a gesture to essentially provide a PIN that takes my strong credential that represents both the user and the device, and as a result, log in. Now, one of the key things is that most of our Win10, it's again about a hybrid play for us. So within that infrastructure, you'll see a lot of provisioning happening up to the cloud. So if you're a hybrid customer, you use your Microsoft Passport provisioning, and all that provisioning that I showed you about authenticated devices all happens out of the cloud. And you use write back to bring it on premises. But we do have some customers who essentially are fully enclosed on premises, and there's no cloud. And we enable that where the next-gen ADFS essentially becomes the provisioning endpoint for those types of credentials. Think about this as something like, for those of you who understand virtual smart cards, think of this as virtual smart cards plus plus that's all built into Windows and Active Directory. Now, finally, there's one portion as part of Windows 10 devices that we've continued to enhance. Just the way that domain-joined machines have a TGT. They essentially, as part of your login, they get a TGT that drives your SSO to other Windows integrated apps. What we've now done is essentially, as part of that login process with the next generation of ADFS, you will also get what's known as the internet-friendly TGT. We call it the primary refresh token. It's called PRT, where you will be able to essentially, we will store an SSO state within the device. So now, as you traverse, you can get seamless sign-in to your AAD applications or your ADFS applications because we have a single sign-on artifact. Finally, my last scenario, keeping time. Now, as I mentioned, the Active Directory team also, we kind of manage the time services within the Windows platform. Now, one of the key challenges is that while it works great for the enterprise, we see more and more use cases requiring more accurate time. Today, we're in the range of hundreds of milliseconds. And if you have bad network, it can go out of whack even more. Kerberos is fine as long as you're within 5 minutes, so we kind of have enough bandwidth. But we see more apps like video rendering apps, distributed rendering apps, as well as certain things, even for our own Azure operations, we need much better time. So we made a huge set of improvements, all right? And I kind of lift. A lot of this is about statistical modeling. Some of the engineers kind of walked me through it a little bit, and I was amazed in terms of how they've kind of done a lot of improvements, where we've taken hundreds of milliseconds and we brought it into tens of microseconds. And just to show you that, the graph of the time variance that you see, the seesawed view, is what it used to be. And somewhere you see a small variation in the middle of that graph, and that is the variation in a Windows Server 2016 environment and the next generation of Windows, where we have a very small variation. And you can also see we've kind of expanded a little bit in terms of the microseconds out there, where it starts to vary at about a few hundreds of microseconds, and you can quickly see that through better statistical sampling that we essentially start converging to about tens of microseconds. That gives you a very good notion of time across different servers. So this way, when you think about parallel computing, it becomes, the time can be a great vector for you to kind of keep things in sync. So that concludes my session. Questions, please come by into the mics out there. A couple of things that my business team said is, hey, there's a Microsoft Mobility Quest. There's a few set of prices out of there. And I'm also going to show one more, which is at the Azure level. as well. So there's lots of cool stuff for you folks. So any questions, please swing by. Yes, we have one here.
In your ADFS proxy servers in Server 2012 R2, you introduced a very nice soft lockout feature.
Yes.
And its only real limitation is that there's only one soft account lockout threshold to protect against denial of service attacks on your AD accounts. So it would be great if you could set that to track the actual account lockout policy in AD. I was just wondering if that's a feature that might be coming along in Server Next.
The question is, can we align the ADFS soft account lockout policy with the AD lockout policy?
Right.
And
one less than that.
And swing by, I'll chat about that. We have some challenges with that. We've thought about that, but we have some challenges. I'll chat with you about it.
Can I ask Wes, the policy templates that you demonstrated, if you were to use those in your relying party trust and you edit the policy, does that change then flow to all of the relying party trusts?
Exactly. That's the whole notion of templates. Yes. All right. Anyone from? Okay, we have more here.
Two questions. The first one is, will it be user certificates or still client certificates when you go to Azure and you provision?
So with the authenticated device, it really depends upon what type of device. We evolve using different types of credentials. One credential is device certificate, but in certain types of devices like Windows 10, we use raw keys at that point in time. It's not encoded as a certificate. And on iOS devices, we have some notion of support coming in with raw keys as well.
The second one is your certificate authority is normally on premises. Now, will that be moved now to the Azure cloud, or will it still?
For the device credential, yes, we use the Azure device registration service, which actually has its own certificate authority to do that. So,
Thank you.
But user certificates can still be managed purely from your on-premises. Yes.
We have moved from ADFS 2.0 to 3.0 now. And in ADFS 2.0, we did some customization based on the home realm discovery for certificate authentication, especially where it automatically detects the mobile devices and it pushes it for the certificate authentication. But now in ADFS 3.0, we don't have that functionality.
You can do that. Come swing by. Talk to me at the booth. I'm there tomorrow afternoon. So if you have an opportunity, I'll show you how you can do that with JavaScript.
Oh, great.
So.
Which booth, by the way?
Sorry?
Which booth we should look for?
I'm going to be in the cloud platform booth and do that. Actually, how about this? Since we're kind of nearly done, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I'll be here for a few more minutes to take your questions. So swing by instead. All right. Thank you.